Welcome to Psychology to Live By. Today's a Q&A with some very ethical people. The podcast to be discussed is the first of two podcasts in the Thee or Me series, and it's subtitled Morality and the Prisoner's Dilemma. Our participants have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. But I'll do a quick summary of part one now before we jump into our Q&A. During the pandemic, we saw the best and worst of humanity. We saw hoarding and profiteering of essential supplies and protective equipment, acts of flagrant aggression and selfishness, and the worst of denialism and conspiracy theory mongering. However, alongside this, we also saw many wonderfully altruistic and kind gestures made to friend and stranger alike. So how can the same circumstances bring about such different responses? Well, it's obvious there is a diversity of personalities and characters at play. And on the other hand, there are diverse environments that nurture us, lending considerable weight to the determination of our behaviours. Nature has equipped us with motives such as self-interest and altruism. And of course, these two often come into conflict. The reason some people were being immoral and others moral in the pandemic was predictably caused partly by nature and partly by nurture. We're all endowed with morality-seeking mechanisms, but unequally. For example, people who are extremely low on the personality traits of agreeableness and conscientiousness are much more likely to be sociopathic. They will weigh the moral balance intuitively towards self-interest. On the other hand, those who are extremely high on agreeableness and conscientiousness will tend to offer better trades to others, often sacrificing self-interest in the service of others' interests, again driven by implicit cost-benefit analyses. But we also develop our moral compass throughout our life, tempered by the rewards and punishments of our village, calibrating our personal morality in response to the pressures of a public ethics and by the rewards and sanctions of society. Implicit messages in society's incentives, rewards and punishments can crowd out or crowd in our civic motives. Public policies informed by a view of humans as selfish, for example, tend to create selfishness. They crowd in our self-interest. On the other hand, well-designed incentives can crowd in the civic motives on which social cooperation depends. These appeals to shared moral interests shift our brain processing away from regions that process threats and frontal lobe cost-benefit analyses to other regions more concerned with social connection and values-based thinking. Assuming trustworthiness tends to elicit trustworthiness. But we should not be naive. There are people strongly predisposed by both nature and nurture to immorality and bad social action. As in the famous prisoner's dilemma, when we're given opportunities to cooperate or betray others for enhanced self-interest, the best long-term strategy is tit for tat. We should first cooperate. If the other party betrays that trust, we should protect our self-interest at their expense. We should not cooperate. If they revert to cooperation, we again engage in altruistic behaviour, tit for tat. In the long run, life prospers as a non-zero-sum game of reciprocal altruism. That said, there's no good reason to be a sucker. All right, so let's now turn our attention to the Q&A, and here are the promised ethical people, my friends. As always, you've watched the podcast. And I'm pretty interested. This one is, of course, a different kind of podcast in the sense we're looking at more sociological and cultural phenomena. So I'm obviously interested in your views, in your questions, in your insights from the podcast. Who would like to kick off?
I can start.
Fantastic. All right.
I was a little shocked about your agreeableness being born with it. You know,
Yes.
Nature versus nurture. I was pretty sure that it was nurture more than anything. And I guess you don't really see that with children as much, but it develops, I guess, or it comes out, their personality comes out as they age. But I wasn't expecting that. To be
Interesting.
honest.
I think that's a pretty common response. Of course, you might be judging by your delightful children rather than
Their
children.
lack of agreeableness.
No, I was clearly not thinking that. I was thinking their high agreeableness. And in fact, research, on sociopathy, for example, which I know is more extreme, indicates that quite commonly people who are sociopathic later in life, we actually raised in pretty loving and caring families, and they showed these traits from a very early age. That is not to say that a chaotic and cruel background can't lead to sociopathy. But the deck is loaded. The cards aren't handed out fairly, and so part of this is it is harder for some people to be good, and they really have to work at it. It's not entirely, obviously, nurture, but it has a very significant loading. I think there's another thing here, Colleen. There is a tendency, I think, maybe culturally, for us to think that there's something morally questionable or wrong about thinking that some things might be more genetically determined, that there's a kind of fatalism and it's not really the case. I mean, we don't think it's morally wrong if someone has got the genes to be short versus tall or blue eyes or brown eyes. And so why shouldn't there be temperamental and personality differences? Of course there will be. And some of them are going to play out in the moral domain. But I hope, I hope it hasn't shocked you too deeply.
No, I mean, I think it really made me think that who you surround yourself with is really important. And and it does make an impact.
It does. And, it also might mean sometimes that it allows us to distance ourselves from certain people and maybe not to expect highly significant change in a person who, as in there's no good reason to be a sucker. The other thing here is that there's a thing called the egocentric bias that we tend to project onto others ourselves. We expect them to be like ourselves, and we judge the world in terms of the way we see it. So it can be hard to accept and understand people of difference, right? And it's no surprise here. I could have introduced you three here as three very agreeable people, right? So we're going to have a. Did someone say two?
Yeah.
Oh. But it won't be a surprise then that we're going to have a particular view in this group, because I'm highly agreeable, by my personality. We're going to have a particular view of human nature that will be coloured by our genetic inheritance. But so it's a deep question. It's a deep issue. But thank you for raising it. What else, guys?
Well, this is a really interesting this really hit home for me, this podcast, both of them, but this one to start. A book that I've just finished reading was a book called Nudge by the economist Richard Thaler, and
yes,
Sunstein was the other one, the co-author. And what they talk about a lot is the notion of behavioral economics.
Yeah.
But they're thinking about it, in that context of people have biases that they don't recognize that might cloud the way that they process and the way that they make judgments in a way that moves them off of what is optimal.
Yes.
Right. And whether that's being bad at statistics and so not properly weighing out the alternatives or whatever. What was really interesting here is that this almost brings in another axis, which is this also altruism versus self-interest sort of spectrum.
Yes.
Which I had not thought about that context in the context of behavioral economics before. And it really kind of, the first insight that I had of that was like, every time that we try to be, it's easy to be reductive and think about people who are really good at this or really bad at this. And you're one of two types of people, but the world is very complex and people are very complex and multidimensional. And there's a lot to consider. And the idea also of like what is optimal means different things for different people based around all of these complexities as well. Yes. And anyway, so it's just like, it really kind of took me on this like journey thinking through how all of these things intersect and how they interact and how broad kind of the spectrum of people can be in the way that we interact with each other.
Yeah, indeed. Look, so many jumping off points there, Chris, but I was very influenced by another behavioural economist, Samuel Bowles, and he wrote a great book called The Moral Economy. And this notion of the way you can nudge in or crowd in or nudge out. Even if someone is highly disagreeable, doesn't mean they're not capable of agreeableness. And conversely, it just changes the probabilities. Right. And so it's still very important that we manage public discourse, that we manage public policy in ways that are more likely to crowd in moral behaviour. Mm-hmm. But as you say, what's considered to be moral is also going to be seen very differently by different people, right? And so a person who, for example, who is by nature more agreeable, moral behaviour is going to be much more about cooperation and, harmony and sharing. Whereas for a person who naturally is low on agreeableness and just naturally views the world more as a competition, they're going to see the world much more in terms of, individual winning and striving, and less around cooperation. And they won't see that as immoral. They just see that as moral as the other person, right?
Right.
So then there's a third question, and this is where it gets really, complex, is, well, where does wisdom sit in this? And wisdom, I think, comes out of a kind of more elevated perspective, a more objective perspective about what actually works best. And in my view, and not just my view, of course, non-zero-sum games, cooperation can be empirically and objectively shown to be better for individuals and the species. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? Free trade, having agreed laws and so all of these things, when we cooperate, the sum is greater. The sum is greater than the addition of the parts.
There's value created by the cooperation itself.
That's it. I mean, we can see culture in those terms. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can say, even though there might be genetic biases for one or the other, the evidence is more towards the agreeable end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. Right? Because of the fact we're such social and cultural beings. Yeah. But yeah, I'm glad you're reading behavioural economics. It's a lovely intersection between psychology and economics. which helped the economists get better models of how people actually behave, that human beings are not homo economicus, that we don't just operate in terms of pure cost-benefit analysis. We often do irrational things as far as economists are concerned. So there was a kind of need for them to incorporate some knowledge about our natural biases and our animalistic nature and our emotions and so on. But it's a fascinating area.
It is. It truly is.
How about you, Terry? What thoughts have been percolating in that wonderful brain of yours?
Well, first off, a disclaimer, there's a very excited 6-year-old just outside of my door because today's December 1st. And for her, Christmas is the whole 31 days.
Of course it is.
So you might hear Santa Claus singing in the background.
Excellent.
So when do we get to escape our genes? When do we get to come off that tundra of Africa 20,000, 10,000, however many thousands of years ago it was? Because it's really messing us up here. So it's like, this is probably for me the most relevant podcast of what's happened over the last 2-3 years in the whole pandemic and how people have reacted and just that whole tit for tat and how that is in itself has amplified division.
Yeah.
It's almost like the division was always there, but it just became amplified due to the majority of society wanting everyone to behave one way versus the hereditary want to be deceptive and do it another way.
Well,
so
it's a massive question, but let me just have a few goes at it. I mean, the short answer is we'll never get over our genes, because they're in the body, and we're happy to take all of the benefits of our genes. We wouldn't want to do without them. But I think at a practical level, I sort of know what you're getting at is, where our genes lead us astray. I think it's, and one of the problems, of course, is that our, Homo sapiens was designed for that world 200,000 years ago. It's roughly, we think, when it's stabilized. And the world now is entirely different. Well, not entirely, but very, 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 very significantly different. And so there's a lot of mismatches between our design architecture and the world we're actually living in. And interestingly, I think one of the major differences is more or less, if you take a Darwinian view, it's not the only view to take, but it's very useful. The Darwinian view is that everything we do is designed around passing on genes, surviving long enough, right? And that's still operative, of course. But the question of our survival is not as pressing as it was 200,000 years ago. In fact, more of our issues now revolve around culture and cooperation. And I think, and this is to finally get to your question, I think we have, because culture has evolved so much and so much faster than natural evolution, and because we have so many opportunities for goods of all kinds, physical goods, psychological goods, relational goods, we can kind of create a new purpose for our life beyond survival and passing on the genes. But the new purpose can be some of the things we were talking about, moral good. How can we be happier? How can we have a life of more, what the Greeks called eudaimonic happiness, this kind of sense of purpose and meaning. And this is where your question comes in. Can we escape, or can we at least transcend in some way some of these genetic constraints on that more elevated goal? And I think the answer is probably yes-ish. And this might be another podcast, but I think we're now talking about the development of character. And I quite clearly distinguish character from personality. Personality being something we're more or less born with, not entirely, but mostly. Character definitely being something that we build. And we build it, hopefully, if we're building good character, we build it to overcome the mismatches and shortcomings of our genetic inheritance. And I think we can do it. In a sense, almost one of the things we're doing today in our conversation is we're reflecting on our experience. We're using consciousness, reflective consciousness. We're using knowledge to practice in and wire through neuroplasticity views that go beyond our genetic inheritance. So I think all knowledge, all learning, and reflection, practicing in, we can become better people. We can become more cooperative. We can become more compassionate, more altruistic, even if the cards were stacked against us, right? So it's not hopeless, but it's hard.
It's interesting how you say you're born with personality, but you can develop character, because there's a like saying, if you want to know how you're going to turn out, just look at your parents.
Yeah.
And so if you want to marry someone, you'd be very, very well versed to look at their parents to understand what you're going to end up with.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not a one-to-one relationship between parents and our genetic inheritance, but the general principle holds. And look, it's easier if we align with someone who we're more, from a personality perspective, compatible with. I mean, that's just common sense. Yeah. But that's when I think your question leads to a very important topic, and that is, this is the real work of life, is to then understand self and then make these long-term, wiring in these adjustments to who we are, to our actual character. So we are more than our personality, clearly.
Yeah, the most interesting thing that you've said, and for me that's resonated with me, is that culture has evolved quicker than the evolutionary cycle, which is fascinating, because I think the world is fractured across cultures right now. And it's because, there's either lack of tolerance or absolutely just no acceptance. So.
Yeah. And this is where our fundamental nature is sometimes in conflict with the fluidity of culture. But that's that is an entirely new podcast.
Oh, that's a whole other book on just culture codes.
Yeah, exactly. But for today, I think, and this particular Q&A, I think that's probably a good spot to draw a line. And again, to thank you guys for 3 very deep and interesting insights, all of which could have been expanded and probably will be into future podcasts and Q&As. So I thank you for that, and I look forward to part 2 of this Q&A of Thee and Me. Thanks, guys.